Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. My guest today is Dr. Chris Walling. Chris has been an active leader in healthcare for nearly 2 decades. His work integrates the developmental, biological, and somatic aspects of the lifespan. His work in academic medicine has included the administration of multidisciplinary leadership teams in hematology oncology, physical medicine and rehabilitation, and geriatric psychiatry. He is a clinical research fellow in the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium at the Kinsey Institute, located at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Dr. Walling is the current president of the United States Association of Body Psychotherapy, the hub of somatic psychology. His clinical focus in the behavioral sciences has examined the intersections of neuropsychotherapy, affect regulation, and somatic psychotherapy. Dr. Walling is the former executive administrator for the UCLA Longevity Center and Division of Geriatric Psychiatry. He currently serves as the Vice President of Education at the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation, where cutting-edge research is conducted in geriatric integrative medicine. Dr. Walling is also a member of the Somatic Experiencing Research Committee at the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute in Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Walling is a clinical associate at the New Center for Psychoanalysis and a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in Los Angeles. So hello, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello. It's good to be with you.
So before we dive into a conversation around the really interesting work that you do in body psychotherapy and somatic psychotherapy, I wanted to just ask a little bit about your own story and what has led you to this therapeutic work that you've become so focused on.
Sure. So I'm originally from Kentucky, as is most of the generations back as far as we can tell. I grew up in a very young family to two teenage parents who were working class people in central Kentucky. And so throughout my youth, I often had a very curious mind and quite the open heart, as is perhaps quite customary of people from the South. And as a consequence, as my life kind of unfolded, I am the product really of great public education. It was ninth grade science teachers who really had me thinking. I still remember to this day, Miss Peggy Welch, who was teaching me, about the Krebs cycle. And that really got me interested in sort of this possibilities orientation of where the academy might take me. And so much of my career has been spent within academic universities, as you were alluding to in my bio. But I've also kept one foot firmly planted, I think, in ethnography and in the exploration of culture and people. And that sense of community from my own background, I think, is really what has always really led to me wanting to think reflexively and to think in terms of lineage. It's what's led me to the yoga world and to the somatic space.
So what particularly drew you to your interest in somatic psychotherapy specifically?
Yeah. So yoga came first for me. And in part because I think, really yoga is a somatic psychology. It's one of the first. And I'm not alone in that supposition. The 8 limbs of yoga that was taught to me, years ago in yoga classes really had me thinking about the mind-body connection pretty early on. I would say as far back as even my early 20s. And what it did is that it invited this consideration that, there might be underlining processes that help actually leverage and advance the health promoting benefits of these practices. So being the curious George that I am, I kind of went all over the place seeking more systems of knowledge and seeking additional practices, whether it was Alexander technique or whether it was voice and movement classes at various arts institutes. I was forever looking to push the boundaries of what were the healing properties and the growth potentials that one could yield from embodied practice.
Mm.
So in somatics, my first entree to somatics was actually my first teacher was Peter Levine
Okay.
in the somatic experiencing space, where I took a one-off workshop with him, I think, and the rest was history.
Mm. Mm. So one of the things that you point out in an article I read of yours is that, you know, the body psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, all of these kind of this new paradigm of focusing on our embodiment is focusing or shifting from a kind of talking model to a feeling model. And I've talked about this with a lot of people on the podcast before, but I wanted to get a little bit to ask you a little bit about that and why that's specifically so important from a therapeutic perspective.
Well, it has a lot to do with, I think, the healing potential really of empathy and the fact that as social mammals,
Mm-hmm.
much of what promotes a greater stabilization of safety in our physiology is through a relationship. I mean, if you look at the common factors research within the field, let's say of clinical psychology or psychotherapy, the one thing that you will find in the common factors research is that ultimately, regardless of the therapeutic modality that a clinician may use, it is the therapeutic alliance, as we call it, that determines treatment outcome. Well, on a practical scale, what does that mean? It means the ability to actually have a human to human connection that is fundamentally emotionally informed. And there was, of course, this boon of evidence based practice that happened from the cognitive sort of wave that really created and influenced a lot of academic thinking in terms of what is the best practice for clinicians, that really created a much more top down model that came into popularity over the last couple of decades. In so doing, it kind of eschewed and avoided sort of the pitfalls of the underdeveloped body of knowledge within humanistic psychotherapies, which had had a strong influence on a psychotherapist's understanding of the role of the body in psychotherapy.
Yeah.
So with advances in neuroimaging and advances in affective neuroscience, we've been able to kind of put old wine in new bottles. We've been able to sort of understand that really what's at play in that therapeutic alliance is a much more felt sense, which is a term that's coined from a somatic psychologist by the name of Eugene Gendlin, who created focusing psychotherapy. That felt sense is this kind of ability to sense into the affective embodied body to body experience that is fundamentally the arc that unfolds the treatment.
Mm. Mm. So, in the context of, you know, an experience of trauma, how would a, like, even maybe perhaps what's kind of the science behind? I know you've been working a lot with Stephen Porges, and so he's kind of offered this model as to why the kind of feeling sort of modalities actually um, have a beneficial effect. Can you talk a little bit about why the feeling approach would actually help resolve trauma, or could perhaps help resolve trauma in a way that a merely talking model would perhaps not?
Sure. So, polyvagal informed therapies, by their nature, borrow from the study of the evolution of the vertebrate autonomic nervous system. And it assumes that many of our social behaviors and vulnerabilities are actually hardwired into our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
The theory demonstrates all sorts of aspects of mental health and has helped to develop treatment techniques like somatic experiencing and many others that aid mental health professionals in renegotiating the hierarchical manner that parallels in reverse the phylogenetic history of our nervous system in vertebrates. So central to the practice of embodied psychotherapies, or in most sort of embodied traditions that seek to target trauma, is the titration of various psychomotor phenomena and sensory inputs that, in order to integrate such experiences into our conscious awareness of, let's say, a survivor of trauma, that they often will achieve that through a deactivation of the latent autonomic distress within the body, within the nervous system itself. So being able to sense into and pick up on cues of safety that promote health, growth, and restoration are the key to sort of understanding how to work with trauma understanding that it's mostly implicit in procedural memories that are below the level of our conscious awareness that require renegotiation in service to resilience and post-traumatic growth.
Amazing. You're so clear on all of these things. I love it. So, when we were talking before the interview about kind of the therapeutic context of these models, and I guess, just to kind of go into that therapy room, as it were, what does a feeling-based approach look like in the context of a therapeutic session? So, for example, I think we're all familiar with the model, the Freudian model of lying on the couch talking about your feelings. But what kind of things happen or could potentially happen in that space when a therapist is coming from that feeling approach?
Sure. Well, it may or may not, depending upon the clinician and their particular style, look terribly different from early free associative processes, with one exception. And that is that there will be less focus upon the narrative. And it's much more sort of designed to help invite a kind of exploratory orienting. And as a result, really is a dyadic, sort of embodied relational form of mindfulness when you're approaching it from what you're positing in others that I've even written about as this feeling-based approach or an affective-focused approach. And that capacity to really leverage orientation or exteroception is really at the heart of many of the preparatory orienting responses that our bodies are capable of doing, that helps us integrate lived experience, how we learn through psychomotor learning. So basic to all modal life is a differential approach avoid response to perceived features of our environment. And the various stages of response are initially reflexive noticing and orienting to stimulus, preparation, and the execution of a given response. I mean, that's classic behaviorism, right? So preparation involves a coordination of many aspects of the organism: muscle tone, posture, breathing, autonomic functions, and emotional state, attentional orientation. So in a session, one might actually simply be stabilizing the capacity to explore the environment. A common sort of trope in somatic psychotherapies is this kind of interventional question of like, and what are you noticing next? Which is about exploratory orienting. Yeah. And it's about this sort of exploration of where one might notice associative processes in which that the environment itself is innately threatening or not, that then invite a kind of relational way of reorienting and exploring.
Beautiful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, this is specifically the strategies around somatic experiencing. And so what are these three core strategies of somatic experiencing? You talk a little bit about them in the article, resourcing, titration, or titration. Am I mispronouncing that?
Titration.
Titration, okay. And pendulation. So can we talk a little bit about this and how this relates to, what we're talking about within the therapeutic context?
Sure. So, within particular SE practice, within my scope of practice, because you have to remember that there are a number of multidisciplinary clinicians who are trained in somatic experiencing. Somatic experiencing by itself is simply a set of principles that can be applied to a number of therapies, plural, whether it be physical therapy, occupational therapy. And so within my scope of practice as a clinical psychologist, there really are three primary sort of core strategies that I may employ. Resourcing is not new. It helps a person sort of experience trauma or in traumatic memory and its effects through a kind of containment where resources for feeling safe and secure are employed simultaneously to help resolve any of the remaining kind of activation that the body may still hold around revisiting certain memories. So this might include the elicitation of a conversation around memories when you had a good time with loved ones, thinking about, a particular place or space that you enjoy going to, of what's it like to enjoy a nice summer afternoon in Cape Cod. So one goal of therapy really is to help people discover and build a supply of both internal and external resources of support. So resourcing is one cornerstone. Titration really is the most significant, in my opinion, contribution that Peter Levine will go down in history for contributing to trauma theory, which is exposing, all standard practices of trauma therapy, regardless of clinical orientation. The gold standard is what we might call exposure therapy or graduated exposure therapy. So titration is this principle that we expose one to small amounts of traumatic related distress over a period of time in treatment in order to build up their affective tolerance, to avoid becoming overwhelmed. So in therapy, people will pay close attention to sensory experience as it emerges, while also simultaneously perhaps revisiting whatever activation or distress is coming up while they're speaking. And that becomes, over time, through the graduated exposure, less and less impactful in terms of distress. And finally, the pendulation aspect, which has sometimes been called looping, or it's embedded in just sort of the nature of how we rock in order to soothe. It involves switching between resourcing and titration at times, and allowing someone to really move between states of distress and arousal triggered by traumatic sequelae versus a state of ease, safety, and calm. And that helps us to sort of regain dynamic homeostasis, which allows us to be sort of both calm and alert.
So as you're speaking, this is making me think about, the trauma-informed therapies that have been, or trauma-informed approaches that have been kind of popping up all over the place. And, I haven't taken any of these trainings myself, but when I have conversations around it, sometimes at least maybe a superficial expression of them is this idea of kind of, avoiding, exposing anyone to any trauma. There's this preciousness around trauma, right? And when you're talking about titration as a sort of like a, obviously within the context of a controlled environment with a therapist, there's this, introduction of small degrees of traumatic experience, or however you would express it. But do you, from that perspective, from what you've just talked about, are there issues that you see with some of these trauma-informed approaches, or are they essentially aligned with the ideas that you're unpacking here?
Well, like all tribes, they don't all agree.
Right.
And so as a result, there's going to be various differences of opinion in terms of clinical style. Even my summary of SE theory, within the SE community, there's going to be differences of opinion about how incredibly reductive I just made it. So I mean, the answer, I guess, to your question is it depends, which is the most intellectually unsatisfying answer that one can give. But but I think, there's so much variability in terms of clinical practice, because, I often say to my patients, look, the therapist is the therapy. And so the relationship is the healing factor. And the uniqueness of the particular therapist that you may work with is going to really determine the preciousness, as you call it, that the trauma may or may not present within the treatment plan. I think trauma theory has really brought our attention to a lot of the major factors of what promotes health and growth and restoration. And that on sort of a leading edge boundary of practice is where I see things now going. We are much more interested now in post-traumatic growth than we've ever been interested in post-traumatic stress.
Wow. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the research that you're doing. I do want to get into yoga therapy research, which is actually the title of a course that you'll be doing with Embodied Philosophy. I'll just plug it right now, although we'll talk a little bit about it later at the end of the podcast, but just to plant a little seed for those that are listening. Chris will be doing a course on yoga therapy research for Embodied Philosophy coming up here in the end of September. So I guess my question is, well, first of all, just I wanted to open it up to you talking a little bit about the research that you're doing, because I know you're very excited about it. And then I'm also quite, when I was reading your bio, I would love to hear a little bit about the research around Alzheimer's,
Sure.
perhaps because my grandma died of Alzheimer's, and
Mm.
so I have this kind of, personal desire to just know how this work is informing our
Sure.
understanding of that.
So let's start then with the TSRC. So at the Kinsey Institute Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, we, under the leadership of Dr. Stephen Porges, are a broad spectrum of clinician researchers and basic researchers who really have come together to help further the understanding of the experiences of survivors of trauma. So although trauma affects all of our lives, we as a society often don't listen to the voices of survivors. Instead, we react and judge based on mistaken beliefs that traumatic events have only a transitory influence on mental and physical health. But we demonstrate this lack of understanding through media, through the judicial system, through even contemporary medical practice, how we organize hospitals, how we organize our school systems, the way our workplaces are designed. Um, in other words, everything is underinformed by trauma theory as we've come to see it. And many of our institutions that form our society are not trauma informed.
Mm.
So, where are the resources to inform society of this profound physical mental impact that trauma has? Where's the information on the consequences of traumatic stress on survivors' social behaviors, on their relationships, on the personal intimacy and sexuality of the survivor? Where does a survivor of trauma find the roadmap describing their symptoms and possible treatments and a timeline that might help inform their own treatment?
Yeah.
So that's really what created the TSRC. Its mission is to fill these important gaps in our understanding of the experience of survivorship based on a new paradigm for the study of trauma, which is polyvagal informed. And in that paradigm, we will witness the survivors' stories through various methodologies, through technologies. These approaches will start with, over the last year, a number of survey-related studies that we've begun to look at COVID-19 in our body, mind, stress survey, to look at LGBT mental health amidst COVID-19, and then also to look at the contemporary experiences of trauma therapists throughout the world in our international surveys. So that's a bit about the TSRC, and as you can see, why it's so relevant to kind of where we all are right now.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Alzheimer's work that you're doing. I would love to just know a little bit about how the kind of somatic approach is helping us understand Alzheimer's in a different way than perhaps it is understood kind of, along the lines of the orthodoxy.
Sure. So the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation was founded in 1993 by Dr. Dharma Singh Khalsa, who wrote the famous book, Meditation as Medicine. Mm. And it was dedicated to preventing AD by funding research studies that provided educational outreach, memory screenings, and doing things of that nature to help promote a prevention-based approach. Because as of today, we still have absolutely no drug that has been developed that can really be of longitudinal service to fighting the disease or preventing it.
Yeah.
So ARPF's philosophy in research is that memory loss is neither normal nor natural as a part of aging, that there are aspects of our lifestyles that help us maximize brain power, reduce the risk of developing AD. And so our approach is using the best of conventional medicine combined with the best of integrative medical modalities. So diet and brain-specific nutrients, stress management through yoga and meditation, physical and mental exercise, and ultimately what we call spiritual fitness, which is akin to what in the literature we might call psychological well-being or psychospiritual well-being. Mm. So it's within those 4 pillars, as we call it, that we help advance the knowledge base in terms of what are the major health promoting factors of those 4 pillars, how do they inform the staggering statistics around the fact that AD affects nearly 5.4 million Americans and many more millions worldwide. And so we really are interested in helping create accessible, community-based public education and public health prevention programs. And that's essentially what we're dedicated to helping create in the world.
Mm. So I take it you would say that a future kind of contemplative culture, or a culture kind of built around contemplative principles, would have less Alzheimer's present.
The data already shows that. The data already says that in various parts of the world where those four pillars are a routine part of the ethos and the culture, have less incidence of mild cognitive impairment, which is the first diagnosis that one may receive along that journey. So it's absolutely the case according to the evidence that we've seen so far.
Amazing. So now a little bit about yoga therapy. I know you do a lot of work, within yoga therapy trainings, and obviously you're going to teach this course on embodied philosophy about yoga therapy research. Having spoken about obviously body psychotherapy and the kind of somatic psychotherapeutic approach that you take, I'm wondering just if these two paradigms of yoga therapy and then somatic psychotherapy, are they completely compatible? I'm speaking to, of course, the more traditional understanding of yoga therapy that perhaps emerged from Desikachar and that sort of lineage stream. Are these two kind of perspectives completely compatible from your perspective, or has there had to be a little bit of zhuzhing to make them fit with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that Western commercialism has absolutely zhuzhed a great deal about the yoga lineages, and in some ways reappropriated it, much to the chagrin of conventional practitioners.
Yeah.
So I do not believe that they are always compatible. And I think that's why, particularly as health promotion practitioners and or clinicians, that there is a profound responsibility of being deferential and respectful of sort of the different orientation that one might approach healing through when you are a classically trained yogi.
Yeah.
So that brings to bear, of course, conversations around how Western universities in particular have approached the legitimacy of indigenous knowledge and the role of indigenous peoples in the advancing of decolonizing interpretive research. But, over the course of the last 30 years in the West, yoga has, of course, because of its commercial popularity, been heralded for its therapeutic and healing properties. And it's evolved into very specific applications of yogic tools like postures, breathwork, meditation, etc., to address all kinds of individual, physical, mental, emotional needs. And today, there are thousands of providers who actually identify as yoga therapists, who, in some instances, if they are certified through the International Association of Yoga Therapists, have demonstrated competencies, have gone through thousands, in some instances, of hours of training. And there are about 200 schools now that train these folks in comprehensive clinical yoga therapy in the United States and beyond. So the incorporation of integrative healthcare into modern medicine is ever the more dependent now upon a shared understanding of how these ancient traditions may actually help advance clinical outcomes of a number of health challenges, which creates an urgent need to help advance the findings of a more evidence-informed, peer-reviewed practice of clinical yoga therapy, if it is to serve within the continuum of care. And that endeavor is, of course, creating a need for research literacy within yoga practitioners, within the yoga community. And I think that's why we're creating this course together, is to help advance that very need.
Yeah, you spoke about before we started the interview of your desire in this course to encourage or invite lay researchers. That's how you described it. What do you mean by lay researchers? And can you talk a little bit more about what the benefit is of kind of, improving contemporary yogis' research skills?
Sure. So medicine is still a practice. We call it a practice. And I think we sometimes forget that. Just like yoga is a practice. And as a consequence, it's about collaboration, information sharing, open access sourcing to information. Shout out to all the open access journals in the world. Um, so ultimately, what we really need, if this is to continue to grow and evolve, is for practitioners who identify as yoga therapists and who are incorporating it within their scope of practice, within the ethics of their scope of practice, to actually begin to think about how they are tracking, capturing, and reporting upon the case histories of the various patients or clients that they're working with. So, what I have in mind in my fantasy of a more research rich and lay researcher informed approach is that practitioners would actually begin to write about and submit for peer review some of their own case histories, who would begin to survey the current and emerging body of knowledge to create a more clinically informed approach to how they're adapting these practices and exploring the risks as well as the benefits so that they hold both in their awareness. And so that's really at the heart of what I meant by lay researcher. Now, as far as research literacy, there is a multidisciplinary application of yoga therapy going on right now in the world. And that means that both, buyer beware as well as clinician do your homework. And so we have to be able to compare and contrast popular research methods that are employed all throughout evidence-based practice throughout all healing modalities to evaluate the epistemic responsibilities of yoga therapy practitioners who will often need to include often subjugated types of knowledge into their research focus. So I really hope to help redistribute the epistemic power to the agents that typically been excluded from epistemic participation in contemporary research, while also holding the kind of vigor that peer review and clinical practice would offer us in terms of our methodology.
Is a part of research literacy, as you're talking, this just kind of came up for me, is a part of research literacy developing the discernment that will allow us to kind of be able to discern between essentially bogus research, but the stuff that gets disseminated in the media, like you see it all the time. It's like, this latest study is, saying that this will cure this. And there's been no peer review. It was just one study that happened and this is happening all the time. Right. And people see it and they think, oh, it's science, it must be true,
Right.
And it's almost, and I feel like it does, I often analogize it to the way that popular astrology actually does a disservice to the more grounded understanding of astrology, because there are, grounded kind of technologies that we could look at with regards to that. And it seems like, that what is happening is that people are kind of consuming this popular research that just is sort of flashy and fresh, but really is not grounded in any kind of scientific peer-reviewed process.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's about, we've done a great job, I think, in terms of theorizing how East meets West in terms of how we can really integrate within our continuum of care these various practices. But what we still have a lot of homework around is to ensure that there are adequate protections for consumers. And to that end, that requires that we inform the very people who are doing the research on what is good and bad research. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that a pilot study is bad. Pilot studies are where things begin. Yeah. But we shouldn't actually be employing interventions within clinical care across various domains of health that aren't actually subjected to randomized controlled trials, even though some may disagree as that at the RCT as being the gold standard. But right now it's the best we've got. Mm-hmm. So we have to employ what we know with what we don't know and hold both and not collapse one for the sake of the other.
Yeah. Okay, so let's end on a provocative note,
okay,
which is this topic of decolonizing research, which is a really interesting idea that I haven't talked to anyone about before. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by decolonizing research and why this is so important?
Yeah, so original theoretical contributions of any field require a profound intellectual challenge. To advance science means that there's a lot of responsibility on someone to sort of lay their claim. So if you know a particular area of knowledge inside and out, and you're intimately familiar with the issues and the controversies within your field, you have a chance to contribute to new theoretical developments. That's sort of the pathway of the researcher in the modern world. And if you choose to pursue a particular theoretical approach, you are often expected to argue against your peers for whatever viewpoint that you're offering as a different way of understanding of this particular phenomenon, let's say, right? And some of the more valuable theoretical contributions that we have seen actually combine disciplines. They're kind of polymath theories that borrow from many different sorts of ways of thinking. In fact, somatic experiencing is heavily influenced by ethology. So the concerns about a decolonizing approach are, of course, historically often been presented as though it's somehow less rigorous. But qualitative researchers have had to go up against those critiques since there has ever been contemporary research because of its political and cultural subjectivity. And what really decolonizing interpretive research does is that it helps invite a consideration that there is often voices for whom we have not really incorporated into our thinking, that there are ways of knowing things that aren't necessarily materialistic or concretized in a kind of philosophical materialism, and also that we have to re-examine some of the hypothetical or scientific assumptions that we have generated in previous findings when we're surveying the literature, and that we're not just proof texting our literature reviews for echo chambers of our own beliefs, but are actually doing the good job of a good scientist of looking for ways in which that we can prove ourselves wrong, which is at the heart of the scientific method. So ultimately, that means decolonizing a lot of the ways in which that research has been constructed within the West itself, learning to yield and to be respectful to other ways of knowing, and including that within your systemic reviews of knowledge, as well as including that in your methodological designs of your studies. That is at the heart of a decolonizing approach, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the things that seems so challenging about that is that it really does, I mean, when you get to the foundation of your own epistemology, sometimes it's so assumed. I mean, you assume the validity of it because it is what is the very bedrock of what you take to be real. And so this is why I've always, I think that philosophy is so important, because it permits you the ability to actually see the fundamental assumptions of your own epistemology, such that you can then even begin to open yourself to other epistemologies. Because otherwise you're just going to assume, well, that's all BS, because like I know that I know that I know.
That's right. That's right. I think that's the real developmental milestone of the capacity to think intersubjectively, to think beyond our own subjectivity, to hold certain polarities and paradoxes within our thinking without pushing them away. And it does require a certain amount of developmental achievement to be able to do that, I think, in our thinking.
Amazing. So where are there any like examples of where this work is being done of decolonizing research fairly well?
Yeah, I would really invite people to check out Antonia Darder's book on decolonizing interpretive research, a subaltern methodology for social change, particularly because much of her work, which I think is based out of Loyola Marymount University, has influenced my own thinking in terms of how I look at study design. And really, she holds an endowed chair position in ethics and moral leadership that is, I think, in my opinion, kind of showing a way shower approach to how we might actually audaciously bring to the fore a more subaltern voice that not only helps interrogate so-called objective lenses, but uses itself to research the other and propagate this idea of othering further in the world, but also to create a more emancipatory and humanistic and organic body of knowledge in the world.
Beautiful. So as we close, Chris, it's been a wonderful conversation. I feel like we packed a lot in. I wanted to, no stone left unturned, as it were. So do you want to talk a little bit about the course you're going to be doing on embodied philosophy and, share with the people listening, why they might jump on board?
Absolutely. So, so much of what we've talked about already in the podcast today are really embedded in much of the readings and the lectures and the didactics and the discussions that we will cover across, I believe, a total of 4 modules. So it will be a month of exploratory orienting to a multidisciplinary range of the body of knowledge and research that exists within both academic and non-academic literature sources. So we'll talk about randomized controlled trials of yogic meditation. We're going to talk about how we look at some basic research, calibrating the HPA axis, and how we can use a multisensory intervention that involves a series of postures, movements, breath regulation, and deep relaxation called yoga to help advance the efficacy of many of the theories that inform clinical practice today. So I invite people to come to Embodied Philosophy and check out the course, and to sign up this month. We start at the end of the month, and I'm very excited.
Me too. It's going to be a great course. So if you're interested in that, just head to embodiedphilosophy.com. You'll find embodiedphilosophy.com/learn, and you'll see a link to the course there. Chris, this has been such a pleasure. Do you want to share where the listeners can find you, your website? Is it Chris Walling, or is it Dr. Chris Walling?
It's actually just somapsychology.com is my private practice in LA. And then if they want to know more about this vast world of body psychotherapy, just to go to usabp.org, which is the U.S. Association for Body Psychotherapy.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been such a pleasure.
Likewise.
All right, let me turn this off here.